In Ukraine today, President Volodymyr Zelensky accused Russia of war crimes over its continued bombardment of the port city of Mariupol, after reports of a military strike on an art school sheltering hundreds of civilians. Zelensky renewed his call for direct peace talks with Vladimir Putin as the West attempts to aid Ukraine not with boots on the ground or air cover, but with economic sanctions. Think of it as an economic shock and awe campaign. Never before has such a large, modern economy been cut off so quickly from most of the world. To better understand the Biden administration strategy, we spoke with veterans of financial warfare against Iran and North Korea and the White House official who designed the current plan to batter nearly every facet of Russia's economy.
The story will continue in a moment.
On the first day of the war in Ukraine, it wasn't a general who briefed reporters at the White House. It was Dileep Singh.
Good to see all of you again, but this is a briefing I never wanted to give.
Singh is the Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics, credited with designing the sanctions that Putin himself described as economic blitzkrieg.
Nice to meet you.
We met Dileep Singh last week, steps from the White House, where the administration was watching the impact of its assault on the Russian economy play out in real time. What are the types of things that you can look at and say, you know what, the sanctions are working?
You hear top Russian officials describing the pain they're under. The indications about how we're impacting Putin's calculus are really evident when you look at the ways in which they're trying to harden their defenses.
What do you mean?
Well, they're taking some desperate measures, capital controls, for example, preventing people within Russia from taking foreign currency out.
How do you read that?
I think it's a desperate move. He's self-isolating his economy. Russia is now on the fast track to a 1980s-style Soviet living standard. It's looking into an economic abyss, and that is the result of Putin's choices. And I can see from his reaction, that's where it's headed.
This is the second time that Dileep Singh has engaged in financial combat against the Kremlin. Singh was working at the Treasury Department in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea. He helped create the sanctions that followed. That 2014 experience helped Singh, who has a degree in economics from Duke and master's degrees in public administration and business from Harvard and MIT, create a sanction doctrine, a playbook on how to better wage financial war on Putin. So this time, as troops massed on the Ukraine border, Singh presented his plan to President Biden, a sanctions package so severe they hoped it would bring Putin and the Russian economy to its knees. Putin's called the sanctions akin to a declaration of war. Is it?
You know, we need to stay sober with our rhetoric. This is a moment for American resolve. There's nothing more important right now. I mean, this is about the freedom of 44 million innocent people who are being terrorized by a dictator, and no one in Ukraine wants them there.
Within 72 hours of the invasion, the U.S. and its allies kicked most Russian financial institutions out of SWIFT, the backbone of the global bank payment system. Then they froze the foreign bank accounts of dozens of Russian billionaires and began seizing their toys, such as this $700 million yacht with its own indoor swimming pool. But the most dramatic strike was directed at the Central Bank of Russia. The U.S. and its allies cut the central bank off from $300 billion it had stashed in American, European, and Asian banks so the Russian government could pay its bills if it ever faced sanctions again. You knew that there were going to be the specific economic sanctions as you approached this invasion. Why not signal the specifics? Could that have been a deterrent?
We signaled as clearly as we could that these were going to be the most severe economic sanctions ever levied on Russia, and that we would take steps that we had not contemplated in 2014.
Do you think that Putin didn't believe you or didn't care?
He probably thought he played chess better than we do. We've disarmed his central bank, and that's why his economy is in free fall. I don't think he planned for that.
Were you surprised how quickly the allies came on board?
It's unlike anything we've seen in the sanctions context. And, you know, maybe at the risk of, there's a certain irony of quoting Lenin, but decades are happening in days. You know, Switzerland broke centuries of neutrality to join these sanctions.
Almost immediately, the ruble turned to rubble, losing a third of its value. The Moscow Stock Exchange shuttered. Russians lined up at ATMs and cleaned out stores. Credit agencies warned that Russia is likely to default on its foreign loans, something that hasn't happened since 1918 during the Bolshevik Revolution.
The best projections I see out there right now are suggesting that Russia's economy is going to be half of its size that it was before this invasion. And we take no pride in the suffering of the Russian people. This is Putin's war, these are Putin's sanctions, and this is Putin's hardship he's putting on the Russian people.
That pressure mounts every day. Over the last few days, Australia added 11 banks to its sanctions list. Japan put another 15 Russian officials in its crosshairs. According to the Brookings Institution, more than 30 countries have leveled a total of 2,500 sanctions on Russian targets, including Vladimir Putin himself.
There's never been sanctions like this before. Is there any concern that Vladimir Putin is now in a corner and can't get out, that there's nowhere else to go for him?
Look, diplomacy is never dead. There are always ways for us to step back from the brink. But dictators have to pay a price for their aggression. We've always had two different tracks of effort: deterrence and imposing costs, as well as diplomacy. That's still our strategy.
One official directly involved told us there was a back and forth between Americans and financial technocrats inside Russia, but that line of communication mysteriously went silent 2 days after the war started.
Look, we can't get into Putin's mind. He's a brutal tyrant. All we can control, all we can ensure is that this will be a strategic failure for Putin.
And what does a strategic failure look like today?
It means his ability to project power and exert influence are fundamentally downgraded. Power is not the exercise of brute force
Of land
to
grabs.
acquire land. That's not what it's all about. In this century, our view is power is much more closely tied to your economic strength, your technological sophistication, and your story. Can you attract ideas and talent and goodwill?
What targets are left?
We can broaden our sanctions. So take the sanctions we've already applied, apply them to more targets, apply them to more sectors.
More banks.
More banks, more sectors that we haven't touched.
Like what?
Well, the commanding heights of the Russian economy. It's mostly about oil and gas, but there are other sectors too. I don't want to specify them, but I think Putin would know what those are.
Dileep Singh's plan got added firepower he didn't expect when private companies started fleeing Russia. Coca-Cola, which sold Coke in every nation except North Korea and Cuba, suspended operations in Russia. McDonald's closed 850 restaurants. Boeing and Airbus have cut off the spare parts Russian airlines need to keep flying across a nation spanning 11 time zones. In 3 weeks' time, 400 companies have left or closed their doors.
Is doing business in Russia worth the aggravation?
At this point, the answer is no.
David Schaefer is the CEO of Cogent Communications. It provides high-speed internet service in 170 countries, including Russia. At this network operations center in Washington, employees monitor the flow of internet traffic around the world. Cogent has terminated its service to carriers linked to the Russian government.
We were concerned that the size of the connections that we provide to those companies could be used offensively.
To launch a cyber attack.
That's correct. That was our number one motivation.
Was there specific intelligence that you were seeing or traffic that you were seeing that concerned you?
So we are routinely attacked, and we had, in normal times, been attacked by state actors and by the GRU, and we're particularly concerned that we were seeing unusual activity and the possibility of a much greater cyber attack.
The GRU is the intelligence wing of the Russian military. It specializes in computer attacks. Schaefer told us his decision to cut service in Russia would cost the company less than 1% of their revenue, about $10 million, so it wasn't worth the risk.
We do not at this time have any physical equipment inside of Russia that can be taken over. We do have equipment as far east as Kharkov in the Ukraine. That equipment has been taken offline. That territory has been invaded by the Russians, and we had to equip our equipment with effectively a dead man's switch. So once we lost connectivity to it, we had to disable the equipment in such a way that if the Russians took it, it would do them no good.
On Friday, in a case of audacious nation-state spin, the Central Bank of Russia referred to the exodus of companies and the cratering economy as a large-scale structural transformation. Days earlier, during a televised address, Vladimir Putin admitted his country's economy had taken a hit from the barrage of sanctions and warned it won't be easy for Russians, who should expect a rise in prices and unemployment.
The idea is to put so much pressure on him that he has to make a change to his policy.
But could all that pressure backfire?
Absolutely.
Richard Nephew knows about dictators feeling cornered. Nephew worked on the Iran sanctions during the Obama administration and left the State Department last month. He told us sanctioning an autocrat such as Putin comes with risk.
A couple weeks ago, they were talking about alerting their strategic nuclear forces. They've already talked about how this is economic warfare and that they will retain the ability to respond accordingly. And if you think about that, right now they're in the midst of actual warfare. If their perception is that they're under attack from other countries, that's a pretty scary thought.
It's a delicate walk.
It's one where you don't actually have a guidebook. There's no set of rules that tell you implement sanctions this far but not that far, and take this step, not that step.
For Russia, what are the potential workarounds?
Well, sanctions evasion is a long practice activity. There are ways in which they can work with other countries, potentially those that are subject to sanctions themselves, Venezuela, Iran. They could potentially also try and increase their relationship with China. And countries at one point have to make a decision. Are they really interested in helping out the Russians, or are they more interested in helping out themselves?
U.S. officials said Russia asked China for financial support. On Friday, President Biden spoke with China's President Xi Jinping for 2 hours.
We've been very clear with China about any support for this invasion and any help it may provide Russia in evading sanctions. And we've also made it clear what those consequences would be.
What would the consequences be? Sanctions?
That's going to remain private.
What is the first thing that Vladimir Putin needs to do so that you might lift sanctions?
Well, we're nowhere near that point. The first thing he has to do is to stop a reckless and barbaric attack on the civilians of Ukraine. That's not happening.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken told National Public Radio that ending Russia's economic isolation would require Putin to stop his war and agree not to attack Ukraine again.
We're not cowboys and cowgirls pressing buttons to destroy an economy. We've spent hundreds of years in this country shaping military doctrine. We've spent a small fraction of that time shaping the doctrine of economic statecraft, but we have one. It's our objective to demonstrate resolve, that sanctions should have the power to impose overwhelming costs on your target.
There are people who think the sanctions are only about regime change, that that's the ultimate goal.
That's up to the people of Russia. Our cause, our purpose is to make sure that Putin's actions are remembered as a strategic failure. That's what's within our control. Full stop.
The head of the IMF on the economic fallout of Russia's war.
Could this set off a global recession?
At 60minutesovertime.com, sponsored by Cologuard.